I want to thank Adrian, Dr. Dixon, for the invitation. Mary Calantis as Dean, thank you very much. I also want to thank you, Mary, for mentioning Sue Nofke. Sue is a friend of mine. She's a good old Wisconsin girl. Her brother was my neighbor. So when Mary would come up for Thanksgiving, Sue would come up for Thanksgiving, she'd stop by my house. So I've been deeply touched by the fact that she has left us so suddenly. And so I hope I can do justice in her honor being here. I also want to apologize for the title. You have one title in your papers, but I don't ever know what I'm going to talk about when somebody asks me to be on a program. So I just give them a title, knowing I'm going to probably change it. I know what the title is going to be the closer I get to the event. So this is the title that I'm going to use, but I think it probably works for what's in your packet. So for the past 7 years, I've attempted to disabuse my colleagues in education research, teacher education, and school and classroom practice that our current fixation on this thing that we are calling achievement gap is misguided and misplaced. Now, this probably sounds shocking to people who know of my devotion to improving the academic performance outcomes for African American and other students of color who have historically experienced school failure. But I want to argue that the move away from achievement gap language is not a move away from a commitment to excellence and equity for African American and Latino students particularly, but all students, but a move towards a broader societal commitment for all segments of our society to ensure the education of all of its citizens. So first, let me be clear. I believe that we can clearly document the academic performance disparities that exist between Black and Latino students and their white counterparts. And I can document it regardless of social class. That is, Black middle-class students perform at levels lower than white middle-class students. Those of you who are in Champaign, you are part of the Minority Student Achievement Network, and you're in that network because of this disparity. But I think constantly referring to this disparity as an achievement gap suggests failing primarily on the part of the students, their parents, schools, or in some cases, individual teachers. I want to suggest that what our students are experiencing is the result of an education debt. The difference between what their academic performance could and should be had the society invested in the education of these Black and brown children over time. Historically, African Americans were legally prohibited from receiving an education for close to 250 years. From 1865 to 1954, African Americans were legally consigned to segregated and mostly substandard schools. After decades of litigation and what appeared to be a legal victory in a landmark Supreme Court case, the data indicate that the majority of African American children still attend segregated schools. And strikingly, the most segregated group of students in the nation is white students. We never have that conversation. But most white students are in segregated schools. They're in schools with mostly white kids, some 80% of whom attend all white schools. And in the nation's largest urban communities, and I realize you're looking at small urban communities, but if you looked at the largest urban communities, you see what researchers call hyper-segregation of students of color. So if you look at this data from, this is fairly dated, but it's probably gotten worse. This data is from 2006-07. You see that places like New York and LA and Chicago, Miami-Dade, Houston, Philadelphia, Dallas, Detroit, Milwaukee, Baltimore, and Atlanta have very low populations of white students. That's the last column. A place like Milwaukee or Baltimore, I think, is a good example here. Baltimore has virtually no white students in its system. So that's a hyper-segregation. But our time here today is not focused on the sad state of what was or is, but rather on the sense of hope and possibility of what can be. And I just want us to be clear that the overwhelming debt that we have accumulated and continue to accumulate at the expense of communities of color is a shared responsibility. Our stated belief in the importance of a healthy democracy requires that we continue to work towards the common good and not only our personal advancement. Now, some people wonder, well, what difference does it make to change the name of something? Those of you who are in the classroom know how many fights have been started over somebody calling somebody a name that's not their name. What we call things matters. And the reason that I kind of hopped onto this notion of debt, it really is pretty serendipitous. I was coming from New York. Mary just came back last night. Stuck in a cab, which is often a state one is in when one is in New York, headed for LaGuardia. And right there at the Triborough Bridge, there used to be a big bulletin board that said national debt. And it was lighted, and the numbers were just flying by. And then underneath that, it said, your portion. And there was another set of numbers, a lot smaller, but big individually. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to pay that. But the question was, why did I take ownership of it? And if you get in political discourse, people will talk about, we got to do something about this debt. We got to do something about this debt. And I agree, we do have to do something about the debt. And later maybe we can talk about the sort of economic ramifications of national debt as opposed to education debt. You should know that the nation has had a debt since 1791. We've always had debt. It's gone up, it's gone down. The lowest it's ever been is $33,000. But in 1791, it was over $20 million. So we've had debt a long time. So I think if we're looking at a shared debt, the question becomes, what do we individually do to pay it down? And I believe that the place of change for students is at what we would call the point of service. In most service occupations, we expect that those closest to the delivery of a service should be the most crucial in delivering that service. So if you're in a hospital, you are likely to see the physician during her daily rounds, but your nurses will provide the majority of your care. You can purchase consumer goods from a variety of businesses, but your willingness to use any particular place of business often is influenced by the kind of customer service you receive. I take my clothes to a particular cleaner's and my husband rails about the fact that how expensive. He said, you ain't doing nothing but buying your clothes back. But I like the service. When I walk in the door, they call me by name. And she pays particular attention to how my clothes get cleaned. So I probably could save a few pennies taking it to another cleaner's. We have a chain in town that I don't go to. I go for the service, just like buying a car. There's lots of places that sell cars, but you often are drawn back to a dealership because of the service they provide. So similarly in schools, the key determinant of a quality education is linked to the quality of the teacher in the classroom. Yes, I think we have to have sound policy. Make sure I have, nope, not there yet, go back. I think we do have to have sound policy that promotes innovation and allows for rational and informed decision-making. Indeed, we have to have administrators who are instructional leaders and visionaries, but they are not more significant than the person who spends 180-plus days with students each year to ensure their academic growth. I always say to my principal friends, I don't care how good you are, I have yet to see a principal teach 700 kids. I just haven't seen it happen. Tell my superintendent friends, you might be like the second coming, but I have yet to see a superintendent teach 25,000 kids. I just never seen that happen. It's the person in the classroom. And for more than 20 years, I've been studying the pedagogical practices of those teachers who are effective with African American students. So very briefly, I began this work out of frustration with a discourse that suggested that it was nearly impossible for poor African American children to achieve academically. And I rejected that notion for some obvious personal reasons. I was a poor African American student who was sitting at Stanford University. So apparently somebody knows how to do this. And so I set about to uncover empirical evidence to support my assertion that African American children can learn and perform at high levels. I also want to point out that although my work has focused on African American children, it's not about African American children. My premise was if we could improve the performance of the kids who are suffering most, we would have some keys to helping all children. And so I did something radical. I made African American children normal. I didn't want to look for deviance, I wanted to look for normalcy. And so I said, if we can figure out what to do with them, that's going to help Latino kids, white kids, everybody's going to benefit. So I made them the subject of study as opposed to the object of study. The teachers who have come to be known as the dream keepers serve as what we call in research existence proofs for my premise of scholarly excellence among black students. So an existence proof, you go find something that actually exists when people say, can't do it. Now, you may not be able to generalize from an existence proof, but you have to stop saying it can't be done. So I have at least 8 examples of, yes, it can be done. And I actually would argue I have a lot more since I started doing this work because I started going out to schools around the world where people are actually doing this work. But more significant than their individual cases or their stories is the collective wisdom that I garnered from understanding their practice and attempting to improve teacher education for novice teachers. So in the remainder of the time that I have with you, I want to discuss the strategies that these exemplary teachers employ to pay down the education debt that is owed to the children and the families that they serve. So my work with exemplary teachers helped to reduce the theoretical notion that we now call culturally relevant pedagogy. This notion rests on 3 propositions: academic achievement or student learning, cultural competence, and sociopolitical consciousness. And my research suggests that all 3 propositions are necessary for creating the quality education that we want to see for all students. Leaving out any one component cannot be considered culturally relevant practice. So I want to briefly discuss each of the components, and then I guess when we do our breakouts, we'll have a chance to do even more hands-on work. So let's start with the academic achievement, or student learning. And actually, student learning is something I've added on to that title. When I first started writing about it, I called it academic achievement, but quickly learned that everybody else thinks of academic achievement as the test. And that's what I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about student learning, and we know students learn a lot more than we could possibly test. So there's no debate over the notion that students are supposed to learn something in schools, and teachers are responsible for facilitating that learning. For too many African American and Latino students, they are spending time in classrooms with adults who may be nice, but are not really teaching them. And this also includes those teachers who are so fixated on standardized test scores that the classroom experience is nothing more than constant test prep. Now, I've heard the plaintive cry of teachers who say, quote, "But we have to get the test scores up." And I believe them. But what I'm saying is that such a classroom experience rarely produces real learning. If it did, then that would be the model that we would expect to see in the best private schools and the best upper middle class suburban public schools. Student learning involves challenging students' minds so that they improve their ability to think. It's not about rote memorization and parroting what is in a text or what a teacher says. And indeed, we are starting to see a cohort of college students with high test scores and a limited ability to succeed in a college classroom that asks them to apply, synthesize, analyze, and evaluate information. They have had limited experience in student learning. In a couple of weeks, I'm doing a workshop for Wisconsin advanced placement teachers. And one of the challenges I have for them is to improve the pedagogy in the advanced placement classroom. The knowledge in advanced placement classrooms is fabulous, but the way it's taught is so aimed towards the test that it's anti-intellectual. And I have a video clip that I will show them that comes from the former dean at Stanford, Mary Stippick, in which Mary says, "When I realized how bad advanced placement was in terms of how we now structure it, was my own daughter went to take the French literature exam, and when she came home from the exam, her words were, 'Whew, now I never have to speak French again.'" Is that the point? That she derived no joy, no love of learning. She just needed to pass the test. So in one of the classrooms of a teacher that I called Mrs. Valentine, the students were challenged to write using more vibrant adjectives in their work. And so Mrs. Valentine used her own emotional reaction to the students' writing to press her point. So when her fourth graders referred to a, quote, "bad witch," Mrs. Valentine began imitating the famous scene in The Wizard of Oz, where the witch declares, "I'm melting." As she began shrinking, her students started shouting out more colorful adjectives: sinister, diabolical, despicable, to save Mrs. Valentine from destruction. In Ann Lewis's classroom, she promoted the student learning by asking thought-provoking questions. I observed the unit entitled, "Is Violence Ever Justified?", where students had to make sense of the positions that nations take to solve conflicts or protect themselves versus what individuals do. Now, initially, students tried giving Ann what they thought she wanted by quickly responding, "No, violence is never justified." But she would not accept that pat answer. And by pointing out the instances of disputes that were common experiences in the students' lives, things like playground fights, and sibling battles, even gang violence, Ann was able to get the students to acknowledge that indeed there were times in their lives where they did think violence was justified. And then she pushed the students to consider alternatives to violence, while understanding that issues of self-defense and national security, they often create a belief that violence is sometimes justified. Finally, Margaret Rossi made a conscious decision to extend her students' learning beyond that of the mandated curriculum. Instead of the 6th grade mathematics book, Margaret scrounged for an Algebra 1 book to begin introducing her students to algebra and higher mathematics in 6th grade. And although students had to share the books because she couldn't find enough, Margaret wanted to encourage her students to think of themselves as mathematicians and to take on more challenging problem solving. Now, the downside of what Margaret ended up doing was when the students went to their middle school was a 7th, 8th grade combination. They were in K-6 elementary. When they went to middle school, they started cutting their math class and coming back to Margaret's class because they said, they're just doing arithmetic over there. You know, we tried to tell them we do algebra. So Margaret had to really work hard to get them back so they wouldn't fail their math class, their middle school math classes. But she had ignited something in them, helping them understand that they could do sophisticated problem solving. So in all 3 examples, these teachers worked to integrate basic skills and knowledge while making their learning meaningful. They were teaching for understanding, not to a test. Their textbooks were instructional supplements, not the determiners of the curriculum. And the teachers functioned as decision makers and curriculum planners and implementers. The lessons were highly interactive, with students contributing to the production of knowledge. The second element of culturally relevant teaching is perhaps one of those ones that is most misunderstood: cultural competence. The term is one that is carried across a variety of fields and practices. I've heard of culturally competent nursing care, culturally competent counseling, culturally competent social work, culturally competent policing. In each case, what I've seen of these so-called culturally competent practices is a list of do's and don'ts regarding how to respond to specific groups of students. This list implies static, naive notions of culture and serve to further distance professionals from the people they serve. So in Wisconsin, we have a large population of Southeast Asian immigrant Hmong descent folks. But what we've known now is we have about 3 generations of Hmong. The first generation was born in Laos and raised in Laos. The second generation was born in Laos, but raised in transition. So they came through the Philippines, the West Coast, and on to the Midwest. The third generation is born in America. They're Wisconsinites for us. So if what you have is information that helps you with generation 1, it does nothing for generation 3. Many of the third generation kids don't know how to speak Hmong. So a lot of them who end up at the university are taking a Hmong 1 class because they don't speak it. So we cannot assume that these cultures stay the same. True cultural competence is the ability to help students grow in the knowledge and understanding of their own culture while acquiring skills in at least one other culture. You know, in my ideal world, kids leave school multiculturally competent, but at minimum, biculturally competent. So do you recognize how most white youngsters are not culturally competent? Because we have an obligation to help them be fluent in a language and a culture beyond their own. I went to do some work with the Austin School District one year, and I think they were very disappointed that I didn't have bad things to say about kids on the East End, where they have mostly Latino kids. I was very worried about the kids on the West End, and those were the kids they were sending to college. And I said, don't you care about those kids? They're like, what? Those are our best kids, and we have, you know, millions, you know, tons of people going to AP classes, and they go to, I said, but they're not culturally competent. Almost none of those kids can speak Spanish. You're doing them a disservice. Do you not believe your own demographics? So it's not just about what do we do for those kids, but what do we do for all kids? So typically, that other culture for kids of color is the mainstream culture that we expect them to navigate to benefit from post-secondary education and to become socially, politically, and economically viable. Note that nothing about cultural competence speaks to eradicating, replacing, or denigrating students' home culture. For a teacher that I call Pauline Hilliard, cultural competence meant embracing the student's language and using it as a vehicle for teaching American edited English, or what we often call standard English. I have trouble with that term, having been to every continent in the world except Antarctica, and if you have any friends at Antarctica, tell them don't invite me because I'm not coming there. But everywhere in the world, I've encountered people who speak English. And what is considered a standard is different. So I call it American edited English, that English that we all use in formal settings. Because we all have an informal. And trust me, having lived in Wisconsin the last 22 years, they got their own English. I don't know where the first syllable of Wisconsin went. Because people there are from Wisconsin. What? Where's the woo? You know? Pauline talked to the students about translating their language rather than correcting it. So she'd say, we might say, my mama, she'd be here at 9 o'clock. But the translation to a standard form, not the standard form, but a standard form, would be, my mother will be here at 9. So what you notice about these two ways of, or then she asked the kids, what do you notice about the two ways of saying this? What is clear about this interaction is that Pauline understands the student's language. But second, Pauline recognizes that it is a language and that her job is to help the students become bilingual. Third, Pauline's students learn to code switch and regularly ask before an assignment if it needs to be in, quote, standard form. Pauline might say, well, you're working on a business letter, so yes, you need to write in a standard form. Or, it's your journal. You can use any form you choose. In the case of Gertrude Winston, cultural competence means having parents and communities regularly share in the life of the classroom. When Winston's 5th grade class was studying life among the early California European settlers, they discussed how people entertain themselves. Because, you know, 5th graders, I once had the pleasure of teaching 5th graders. I'm actually a secondary teacher, but I got that special treat. And their concept of time and chronology is, first of all, those are very difficult concepts, so I'm not denigrating them. It's really hard to understand time and chronology. And you start talking about exploration, 5th graders say, now, was you there? Now, did they have, I mean, it's hard for them to grasp it. So they could not grasp the world without television. They're like, really? And I have to laugh because I have a friend who was a principal in a middle school in California, and he said when his 5-year-old, his own son, they were talking about changes in technology, and he said, you know, when I grew up, we didn't have color TV. We had black and white TV. And he said his 5-year-old said, black and white? Everything was black and white, Dad? He said, mm-hmm. The grass? Mm-hmm. The sky? Mm-hmm. The flowers? Yep. And then he said his 5-year-old ran to the window and said, Dad, when did it all change? Kids cannot grasp a world beyond that they have lived in. So they asked Pauline about, you know, well, what did people do? You know, they didn't watch TV or didn't go to the movie. What were they doing? So she started talking to them about quilting bees. Quilting bees, asked the student. What's a quilting bee? And before long, Winston and the class were planning a simulated quilting bee, where the parents would come and make a quilt to be donated to a nearby homeless shelter. And Winston encouraged the parents to come with small children in tow because there were no babysitters and daycare centers in the 1850s. People lived more intergenerationally. And Winston was determined to show her students both how people lived and how what they and their families had to do and what they could offer and support and enhance their learning. So a lot of times these kids think their parents can't do anything, but they really can do lots of things. What's really funny about that particular lesson, Winston doesn't let the kids use the drinking fountain because it's 1880, there was no drinking fountain. So they had to fill up this bucket, and they had these cups, and they just hated it so much, so they weren't drinking any water. So she said, so all these requests to go to the drinking fountain are like misplaced, right? You guys don't really need the drinking fountain. But it was a really interesting experience to just sort of be sitting there with these low to moderate income parents, sewing these quilts, little kids running around, other kids, the fifth graders trying to manage the kids and trying to help with the sewing. I think Winston also paid strict attention to the parents' fears that their kids' education could end up alienating their children from them. The third piece is sociopolitical consciousness. And I sometimes go into classrooms where teachers are working hard to ensure student learning, and they have done the necessary work to support cultural competence among their students, but they seem to omit the call for developing what I've called sociopolitical consciousness. Why get into sociopolitical issues in school? First, I think it's important to understand what sociopolitical consciousness is. In its simplest form, I think of it as the so what factor. You know how kids always come to you and say, why do we have to learn this? And we give them the worst possible answer. I don't know, it was like probably some big book of teacher adages that we use, but we universally give them the same answer. You're gonna need this next year, you know. By fourth grade, the kids have figured out you are lying. I am not gonna need this. Don't even talk to me about this. But it is the reason why we supposedly teach what we teach. As I said, our students ask either explicitly or implicitly why they have to learn certain things, and we don't have good answers for them. We give that answer that we're going to need this. You always say, we're going to need this in middle school. I talked with a group of middle school teachers, and I asked them what questions they wanted their teachers to answer for them. And the overwhelming question is, why do they keep trying to scare us about high school? They're not going to let you do this at the high school. If you don't have your work at the high school, they ain't playing over there. One girl said, my sister's in high school. She ain't scared. I mean, she's doing the same stuff she used to do over here. So, we keep trying to tell them about a future, but we forget that students are living their lives now. And they need to understand how in a democracy their learning is useful, not only for them, but for the greater community and public good. And again, the teacher I called Ann Lewis was a good example of creating sociopolitical consciousness. When one of her students complained about how much he hated living in his community, Ann used his complaint as a catalyst for a broader community study. Rather than reinforce the notions of undesirability and escape from the community, Ann helped the students research the history of the community and recognize the changes that economic, social, and political conditions that had brought it to its current state. And ultimately, Ann's work with the students helped them produce a land use plan for an abandoned strip mall that was in their community. Another example of developing sociopolitical consciousness occurred in Julia Devereaux's class. Her students got involved in a project where they collected life histories of disabled veterans who were confined to a local VA hospital. In exchange for sharing their stories, Julia's students worked out bureaucratic issues for the veterans. They made phone calls, they wrote letters, and did follow-up for the veterans. It's really funny, one of the things that bureaucracies do to thwart you is they make it hard for you to penetrate them. So you call, and they put you on hold, and knowing you'll get frustrated and give up. What they don't understand is that it is impossible to frustrate a fourth grader who's been allowed to get on the telephone and call somebody important. So the fourth graders are like, they playing music. And they would just wait. They didn't care. But these veterans who were quite ill and did not have the patience were able to, tell their story. We have their stories actually on film. We did a video. But a lot of them got some problems solved. What was interesting is when Julia was doing this project, she had critique from colleagues. I don't know why you're taking those kids over there. Those people are dying. And Julia said, we live in a community where people are dying every day. Kids are getting shot, and they're becoming immune to life and death issues. So I'm trying to get them to develop relationships with these people to care about them so that when they do die, it matters. And so that was a part of that sociopolitical consciousness. In each of these instances, Anne and Julia's students used their literacy, mathematics, social studies, and science knowledge and skills for a larger social purpose. They were learning that their school learning had significance beyond the four walls of their classrooms and the narrow constraints of a standardized test. So it takes all three, student learning, cultural competence, and sociopolitical consciousness, to begin to pay down the education debt that has accumulated over these many centuries. The pedagogy of poverty that Marty Haberman talks about is one that many of our students are exposed to, and it will not pay down this debt. This is a teaching that is comprised of 14 specific acts that constitute the core of urban teaching: giving information, asking questions, giving directions, making assignments, monitoring seat work, reviewing assignments, giving tests, reviewing tests, assigning homework, reviewing homework, settling disputes, punishing noncompliance, marking papers, and giving grades. There are times when any one of these activities might have a beneficial effect. But Martin Haberman writes, taken together and performed to the systematic exclusion of all other acts, they do not work. Pedagogy of poverty is sufficiently powerful to undermine the implementation of any reform because it defines the ways that students spend their time, the nature of the behaviors they practice, and the basis of their self-concept as learners. Essentially, it is a pedagogy in which learners can succeed without becoming either involved or thoughtful. There's one group of kids who respond to the pedagogy of poverty. Those are the kids who are struggling. Why? Not that they learn anything, but because this is so routinized. So if you've ever been in a classroom where teachers gotten really frustrated and decided the way to punish kids is to have them take out sheets of paper and write, 500 times, I will listen to the teacher. There's one group of kids who actually likes that assignment, the kids who are failing. So, you've seen how the kids do it. Will. And the time they have it done, it's all kind of shifted to the side, The kids who like that assignment are struggling to read, do mathematics, or any other really intellectually engaged task. But they can do this. And so they do it and hand it in. But they haven't really learned anything. Further, Haberman asserts that the pedagogy of poverty appeals to those who did not do well in school themselves. It appeals to those who rely on common sense rather than thoughtful analysis. It appeals to those who fear poor children and children of color. And as a result, they are obsessed with control. It appeals to those who are unaware of the full range of pedagogical options. So as I close, I want to once again lay out the enormity of the debt in hopes that I can begin to move you away from the gap discourse. And for this, I turn to the discipline that I study, history, to make the point. In his book, A Larger Memory, History of Our Diversity with Voices, the late Ron Takaki points out that at a pivotal point in the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln recognized that the Union Army did not have sufficient manpower in 1863 to win the war or save the Union. So Lincoln decided that he would emancipate the enslaved Africans in the Confederacy, and despite his earlier prohibition, Lincoln permitted blacks to enter the Union Army. Lincoln stated, and I quote, "The physical force which the colored people now give and promise us, neither the present nor any coming administration," without the physical force which the colored people now give us and promise us, neither the present nor any coming administration can save the Union. So if we don't have them, we have no Union. Recognizing that allowed the blacks to participate and produce almost 200,000 black soldiers in the Union Army. And Lincoln asserted that without them, quote, "we would be compelled to abandon the war in 3 weeks." In other words, the black men who fought for the Union, at least 1/3 of whom were ultimately listed as missing or dead, made the difference in determining that, quote, "this government of the people, by the people, for the people, did not perish from the earth." In that broader historical context, I ask you, what do we owe their descendants? Is it too much to ask for a quality education for the heirs of that profound sacrifice? Those Civil War veterans and all of the subsequent African American war veterans are not the product of an achievement gap. They are the holders of a promissory note for a debt that is long overdue. As we better understand the nature of the immense contribution that African Americans and Latinos and others have made, that we all might benefit, we better understand that the least we can do is ensure that they receive an outstanding, free public education, that this nation does not perish from the earth. Thank you.